Point. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for organizing actually this whole workshop series in this semester. I think it's been really great, and I'm really grateful for all the work that you've done for this. I'm also grateful for the chair to pronounce the title of my talk, because I submitted it and then discovered I couldn't pronounce the word myth very well. So that's a bit of unfortunate. This is joint work with my colleagues J de Koeijer and Bas Kokshoorn. So J de Koeijer is an expert in combining evidence of different fields at the NFI. And Bas Kokshoorn is a DNA expert. And Jacob, well, you've just heard what his expertise is about. I work at the Netherlands Forensic Institute. That's my main position. I also have a position at the University of Amsterdam. So this talk is about Bayesian networks in forensic science, and I think there are many ways that these networks can be useful. So, for example, we can use them as an expert system, simply as a probability calculator. For example, at the NFI we have a system called Bonaparte, and it uses Bayesian networks for DNA relatedness analysis. Also, Peter presented some ongoing research where we use it for glass evidence. It's also very useful to just think of Bayesian networks as a general model for your thinking, as sort of a template thing, or idioms like Dave Lagnadet like to call it, or Norman Fenton. So at the NFI we have produced networks for analyzing tape, for example, different traces you find on a tape, maybe a fingerprint or DNA. And you find you can combine it with other expertise. We also use these type of networks for doing activity level DNA cases. So we use it as a sort of template. You can also use it as a simulation tool. So we did that in what we call the CSI The Hague project. So it simulates a random crime scene actually, and what items you find on the crime scene as a sort of education tool. There's a way you can use it as decision analysis, because you can also put decision nodes on this with utilities and so on, and it can make optimal decisions for you. So that's what we do at another project called real-time identification. You can use it for pre-assessment. We haven't actually done that, so I'm really curious if somebody is doing that. I'd be interested. But this talk is about something else. It's about probabilistic reasoning in a specific case. So people were asking about Jacob's presentation, well, how can you use it in a particular case? I will present an example. And also J de Koeijer, who's an ITFO expert, he likes to make these kinds of networks for the cases he does. So this talk is about a particular case. So I have to make this disclaimer. It's based on a real case series. I adapted some of the details for this presentation, so there can be no conclusion whatsoever for the real case. This is an attempt at some British humor. I'm not sure if it works. What I'm going to present is, well, basically nothing new, because lots of it is published. Part of it is nonsense, but I marked those parts in blue and also with a big busted sign on it. I present a very biased literature selection, mainly promoting my own papers. I present some very simple Bayesian networks that can easily be improved. And at the end we have a very depressing conclusion actually. So, the case itself. As I told, it was a serial case. And it consisted of robberies at 6 crime scenes. So there were robberies at the supermarket, at the post office, at the bank, another post office, another post office, and another post office. And on all of these crime scenes, there were objects of interest, and they were analyzed by the police. DNA samples were taken from them. So here we have 2 tie wraps, for example. Here also we had tie wraps. Here we had shoelaces, and some of the shoelaces came from the shoes of the victims. So the perpetrators, they would rob the place by first hiding in the ceiling, and then when somebody opened the safe or something where the money came from, they sort of jumped out of the ceiling, and then they sort of threatened all the personnel, and they tied them up with tie wraps or sometimes their own shoelaces, and they also brought shoelaces. Also, they used these kinds of straps to hide in the ceiling. So we also found straps here. There were DNA profiles on straps and shoelaces. Also, this is sunglasses which were found in the getaway car, and there was not, it was sampled, and then it was sent back to the owner of the car because the car was stolen. And then the owner of the car said, well, this is not my sunglasses, and he sent it back again. So there was a sort of breach in the chain of custody, yeah. And also there were DNA profiles with the helmet and the jacket. So, lots of evidence to summarize for the DNA. In all cases, we had several DNA matches which were found with the suspect. And in all but one case, we had very strong matches, very strong evidence at the source level. So the source of the DNA had a likelihood ratio of more than 1 billion. It was a match with the suspect. Except for post office 4, then we only had a likelihood ratio of a maximum of 1 million. But all samples were taken from what we call movable objects. You can move them. It's not like a wall or something at the bank. So as I told, the modus operandi was quite particular. They landed from the ceiling 5 times, 1 times not. There was the bank where they did a different style. They entered with the employee together. But in all cases, the employees were threatened and tied, and there were two offenders. The suspect was also identified in a particular way. There was this post office 3 where they had a DNA database match with somebody. This somebody was Mr. X, and he confessed and he was convicted. So he was one of the offenders, and then the question was, who's the other one? And the police started to investigate around this particular person X. So the suspect was a friend of X, but he was abroad and he couldn't take a sample to test him. So his brother was in the Netherlands, so they tested him, and there was not a match on YSTR, the male lineage, but there was a match in the female lineage, a mitochondrial DNA match. Based on this match, they were able to ask for an international search for the person, the suspect. And at some point, he entered Brussels airport and he was apprehended. They got a match. They had a direct comparison then, and they searched for the database, and then came all these 6 cases. So there was a database match in 6 of the cases.
Very so a quick technical point. Don't brothers have to match on their YSTR?
No, full brothers.
If they have different fathers.
Different fathers. They're not full brothers. Okay.
Apparently.
So there are several interesting aspects about this case, and the question is, what is the evidential value of all this? So we have database matches, partial DNA profiles sometimes, we have movable objects, we have combinations of different DNA profiles in the same case, but also in different cases. And we have a similar modus operandi, entering through the ceiling in 5 out of 6. And the defense were saying that this was basically all of coincidence. So they were saying, well, maybe this person he does construction works, and maybe somebody at the construction site took this. He may have touched the tie wraps. Somebody else takes the tie wraps and goes off and robs the supermarket. So well, they are linked. So this is gone. And then all of it is movable objects, so none of this, it's not worth anything. We can get rid of it because it's movable. Also, there's a breach in the chain of custody there, so we cannot take that into account either. And well, this is clothes. He borrows his clothes to lots of people, so maybe he borrowed it to a defender who offended this place. And well, that's basically what the defense said. So the question that was raised in the case, and that I got in the end to say something about, was this. What is the evidential value of DNA traces obtained from movable objects, and how can these traces, which are found in cases with a similar modus operandi, be combined? So I wrote a report, and I had to decide, I'm going to present some probability calculus or make Bayesian networks and present numbers in the report. I decided not to do that. I decided to focus only on the probabilistic reasoning and not on the calculus. So I wrote a report saying what are the probabilities that are relevant to assess, what to do with them, and especially what not to do with them. So that's the focus of my talk here, myth busting. And how to combine all these probabilities in general, and also for these 6 cases. I constructed some very simple Bayesian nets just for my own reasoning, basically. And the Bayesian networks were mentioned in the report, but they were not presented in the report. I also said why, because I think it leads the discussion in the wrong way. If you do, the discussion will focus on the numbers and where the arrows going this way or that way, and it's not what you want. So I started with a very simple observation. And the aim of my report was to sort of tell the lawyers, well, there are lots of lawyers think in different ways, but some of them like to think in rules. Like if it's a partial match, it's not worth anything. If it's on a movable object, it's not worth anything. And so they like to think in these kinds of rules. And the aim of my report was to go myth-busting and bust some of these rules. So I first looked at a very simple case. We have one case, one offender, one DNA trace from the offender. And what we had, of course, was database matches. And then what you have is a whole discussion about selection effects. So a lot of people have argued in the following way. When a suspect is identified through a database search, we have made multiple comparisons. We should correct evidential value for this. Hence, the evidential value of a DNA match is small if the database is very large, and we do have a very large database. Now, I said at the beginning that everything in blue is a myth. I think this is a myth. And actually there are lots of papers around here. One of the first actually is from Phil David and Julia Mortera. Also there's a paper by David Boulding, and then lots and lots of other papers about this. I also present my favorite paper, which is my own. It considers it a little bit more broad than just DNA. It considers it to other types of evidence where we do selection and screening in a special way. And all of these papers more or less argue the following: that the database search, well, it just excludes a lot of suspects. You compare a lot and they don't match, so they are excluded. They're not the source of the thing. So that doesn't decrease the evidential value, it increases it actually. So the evidential value of the DNA does not decrease due to the search. The profile does not become less rare just because it's in a database. The rarity stays the same. What is different is the other evidence in the case. So if you look at the other evidence in the case, it may be completely missing if you find a suspect through a database search. So that means that the prior odds of this person being the source of the stain can be extremely small. And that's special about these database search scenarios. But lay people may not realize this effect. They may not realize, oh, I have a very strong likelihood ratio, but maybe I have a very small prior. They don't do that. So I think that the experts should warn against this. So here's myth one that is busted. This is not true. And then we had lots of partial profiles. And here is a myth which my colleague Aad Kloosterman likes to call erosion of the DNA evidence. So people would argue like, well, normally we have these DNA profiles and they always quote a number like less than 1 in a billion. And now we have partial profiles, so we may have 1 in 2 million or 5,000. So that means these partial profiles actually have very little evidential value and we might as well toss them in the bin because they're not this 1 in a billion.
What is the situation regarding identical twins?
Identical twins cannot be separated, they have the same DNA profile.
Yeah. So that makes them more likely than 1 in a billion.
Yeah.
I mean,
If the person has an identical twin, we cannot distinguish.
Just in this country, there are several pairs of identical twins, and we only have about 60 million people together.
Yeah. So there are lots of things that I'm not discussing here. Okay. So relatives, also brothers, have a larger random match probability.
Actually, there are methods to separate identical twins now.
Yes, there are. Yeah. So the new DNA methods. Yeah. That's very recent. Yeah. So this reasoning is a myth, I think. Because if you look at the effect of these partial profiles, suppose the likelihood ratio is 5,000, what does it do to a prior probability of 1%? It raises it to 98%, and 2 million raises it to 99.995%. So it's really quite strong evidence actually. And if you look at this entry guideline, that some people like and some people hate, well, the likelihood ratio of 5,000 is called strong support, and 2 million is extremely strong support, which is the largest category. So this is a myth. It doesn't have little evidential value. This is busted. There's no general rule saying partial profiles have no evidential value. And you can illustrate this nicely with Bayesian networks. So you can have a very simple Bayesian network saying, look, who is the offender? Is it the suspect or is it an unknown person? And what's his DNA profile? So suppose in this first case I have a trace from the offender. Suppose that's not disputed. Then I can look what happens if I put in a match and the random match probability is really large, 1 in a billion. When this happens, if I put in the match, then the posterior probability is raised enormously that it's the suspect. And you can play with it. You can say, well, if it's now a random match, a database match, sorry, the prior probability may be really small, so I can play with that and see the effect. Also, I can change the random match probability and look at the effect of these things. So these things, as a forensic expert, are very useful just to play with and see the effect. Also, there's a paper who actually modeled the database search problem in a Bayesian network. So now let's make it a little bit harder. We have one case, one offender, and one DNA trace which is possibly from the offender. So we're talking about relevance now. Is the DNA from the offender, yes or no? And then there are people argue with alternative explanations for the DNA match. So they're saying, like, if there are innocent explanations for the presence of the DNA, suspect's DNA, it has no evidential value. Because we cannot exclude that this scenario would be true, therefore we cannot do anything with it. So this is a myth. Also with movable objects, there's been lots of cases in the Dutch judiciary, but I cannot pronounce the word again, where sort of we look at the verdict and we think, well, the judges have used a sort of rule saying if it's a movable object, it's not worth anything, and we toss it in the bin. And the argumentation seems to be, well, movable objects can be manipulated, so the offender may have planted the evidence, or he may have unknowingly transferred the evidence, and anyway it's movable, so the relationship with the crime is not clear. So because of all these reasons, we just toss it in the bin. It's not worth anything. So this is also a myth. There's also a myth of absence of evidence. Absence of evidence is no evidence of absence. It's a very well-known myth that this is not true. And people will use this in, for example, DNA from the unknown offender, if it's observed or not, or if there's no DNA from the suspect which is observed. So I think in all of these things that people forget about relevant questions. So the relevant questions is not, is it possible to think of an alternative explanation, but how probable is that alternative explanation? What is the prior probability of this explanation? And for DNA, we have two situations. What's the probability of transfer, persistence, and recovery of the offender's DNA? So here it's very important to realize that we do not take, like if we have this blouse, for example, we do not take samples at random locations. We take samples at a particular place. When, for example, there's a story that somebody touched here, we would sort of sample here. We would target specific samples where we expect to find offender DNA. Because DNA analysis is quite expensive, so you don't want to, you want high probability to find the true offender. So it's normally the probability of finding the offender's DNA a priori is quite high, or relatively high. What's the probability of transfer, persistence, and recovery of the suspect's DNA in case he's not the offender? And what's the probability of not observing someone's DNA? These are all very relevant questions, and people tend to forget about them. So you can also look at this by toying with the Bayesian network. This is my very simple network. So here I have the DNA match. Here is the donor of the DNA, which is well known. Here is the offender, which is of the real interest. So it may be the suspect or not. And there are two ways that the suspects, there's transfer of DNA. It could be from the offender to this object, or it could be innocent transfer from the suspect to this object. And if the suspect is the offender, then it goes here. And also there can be background DNA. Background is modeled here as the unknown. So the donor can be, I just said, the suspect is in there. There may be other people also donated DNA to this sample or not. If the suspect is not included, then it's of interest whether the offender is included. And if the suspect nor the offender is included, then it's just unknown people who are there. And then you can toy with it and see, well, what happens if you now insert the match. And you see that, well, this is, if you have this structure, then you have a very high probability that the suspect is indeed the offender. And you can play around with the numbers and the structures and all sorts of things. What about error? That's also maybe a very relevant thing to think about. A number of people have argued that error has a major impact on evidential value. But there are also myths around, I think. One of them, I'm afraid, is in a paper by Thompson, Taroni and Aiken, and they argue that the error rate should be incorporated in the likelihood ratio. So the forensic laboratory should not, am I not quoting it correctly?
Oh, go on, go on.
Well, then other people were saying it.
See my name in blue.
Sorry for that.
But go on, go on.
Some people have argued that we shouldn't present the random match probability. We should present a sort of joint probability where we also take into account the possibility of error. I think that's a myth, and I will explain why.
Well,
And other people have argued, well, there's a possibility of error and transfer and all sorts of probabilities, and we don't really know them, so no number should be reported at all. So even the random match probabilities, it shouldn't be quoted in court. No number should be recorded, just say there's a match. I think both of them are myths. Here's my biased literature selection again. There are many wise words which have been said, I think, by David Balding in a paper. And there's a nice paper by Norman Fenton, Martin Neal, and some person I can't pronounce the name of. Sorry. They made a Bayesian network for these error structures. Also, my colleagues and I produced a paper where we actually looked at error rates. What is an error? How is it defined? How many errors do we make? So we looked at 4 years and we specified for all types of mistakes how often do we make the NFI make the mistake. What is the impact and what is the communication of these mistakes? So regarding error, I think it's very important to realize that there are many different types. There's not one general error rate or something. There is contamination, there is sample swap, there is all sorts of human errors, there are all sorts of different kinds of mistakes, and they have all sorts of different consequences. So for example, if we screw up the reference sample, that's a mistake, but there's no consequence whatsoever because we have 4 swaps and we just take another swap, reanalyze it and have the correct sample. So this is a mistake which has no consequences. If we contaminate, for example, a crime sample, that has major consequences. If we swap reference sample, that has major consequences. So these are different types of errors with different types of consequences, and they have different rates of occurrence. And so we produce some general numbers for general cases, but every case is different. So if first we analyze the DNA from the victim, so to speak, and only after that we get a suspect, then the suspect's DNA cannot have contaminated the victim's things because the analysis was already done before we got the suspect items. So for every case, if you want to look at error rates, you need to look at the case and look what sort of errors are important and what the probabilities are. And we can do it, it's not impossible, but it's very laborious. You have to look at all things that could have happened, etc. So in practice, this is not possible for most cases, and it's not feasible to incorporate it in the likelihood ratio. Also, I think the random match probability is of interest. People have argued, well, the probability of error is much larger, therefore it can be ignored. But I'd like to know that it can be ignored. Maybe it's 1 in 10. I'd like to know that I can ignore it. So I think we should report this random match probability. And concerning the errors, we believe the best way is to report random match probabilities and educate the lawyers to have an open eye for the errors. We can also play with the Bayesian network here. So now I have made an error node here just to see what happens. And for this particular series, I was interested in a particular type of error, which is a reference swap. Because if we swap the reference sample, it could explain all the matches. So this is a very important thing. So I just put some numbers in which were based on my paper, but if you really wanted to analyze, you should look at the case itself. This was just toys. And you see, so I have a reference sample, also an error affecting just a single sample, or no error. If you put in a match, then what you see is that it does have a major effect on the evidential value. So Tom, I will give you some credit. So that was a really good conclusion from your paper, that it does have a major influence.
I think that's all we said too. I don't think we made any statement about how these things should be reported in reports and testimony, but maybe I'm wrong.
Maybe I misread it then. So there are several myths. There are innocent explanations. It has no evidential value. If the DNA is on a movable object, toss it in the bin. Absence of evidence, no evidence of absence. Error rate should be incorporated in the likelihood ratio. Or for DNA, no number should be reported at all. I think all of them are busted. I don't like them. No general rules about this. Let's make it even more complicated. Now we have one case, 2 offenders, 2 DNA traces. How are we going to combine them? So, suppose we find 2 DNA traces matching a suspect. What does the second DNA match add to the first? What does it do? And people will argue, some people will argue, well, it adds nothing. You know, I just made the same observation twice. Adds nothing. And other people will argue, well, the second DNA match, it adds a lot. Because it's on a separate object, so they're independent observations, and therefore the likelihood ratio is squared. It's two independent observations, right?
Many tests as you can.
But this is what people...
Or they have the same object on 2 different occasions.
Yeah, so people argue like these are independent objects, therefore likelihood ratio is squared. So these are myths. And you can see that if you actually make a Bayesian network. This is, here you will recognize my first Bayesian network. Now I copied it here, and could be, you know, if I have 2 tracers, it could be from the same donor or not. And actually this is a quite simple network because there could be a relationship here, which I have another network I'm not showing, I plotted there. This network is just exploring the issue of the error here. So if I have a reference swap, it will affect this DNA profile, but also this one. So now you can again play with it, implement the evidence, instantiate the evidence, match here and a match here, and you can look what it does to all the nodes. Here is the offender configuration. X means the suspect is the offender in both traces. This is one, this is the other one, and here we have 2 different persons. So there was a case with 2 offenders. So here, if we compare it to this one, here we have the offender, 70% probability that is the suspect, here we have, this is where he's none of the offenders. Here we have a situation where he is, if you add it up together, it's 80%. So you see that the second DNA match, it does add evidential value. It's not nothing, but it's also not squared. So the second match does add something. It affects also the error nodes. So all probabilities are changed, but the error nodes are important. The errors of a single profile become less probable. Errors affecting all profiles, so like a reference swap, become more probable. So these myths, again, are busted. So the last thing, we have not one case, we have 6 cases. Well, just make a model for 2 cases first. And this is where I use the work of Jacob. Consider a crime series with a rare modus operandi. This is evidence that there is a single offender, maybe. Suppose we have what we call an anchor case. So there's enough evidence just in this case to convict the suspect. Well, then, you know, he probably did this case. This is a single offender, so he probably also did the other case. So for the other case, you need less evidence. This is not a myth, but these are. So people will argue with chain evidence. We call this argumentation chain evidence. Well, that's unfair. You know, evidence observed in one case, it cannot be used as evidence in another case. That's unfair for some reason. And the lawyers, if you look at the jurisdiction, they have imposed conditions for this reasoning. They said, well, we need an anchor case. We need one case which stands on its own. And also, they said, well, there has to be a similar modus operandi. Otherwise, we cannot use this reasoning. Here again is my biased literature selection, which now is the paper by Jacob, and another paper by Jacob, which is in Dutch, for the Dutch people. So here is this is a small Bayesian network. Here we have now the modus operandi being the same. Here we have 2 cases, different offenders. What is the effect of the modus operandi being the same? Well, you can play with it, you can instantiate the DNA matches and see what happens. Also, as I put in here the observed things. And now what you see is that there's quite a large probability that, again, that the suspect is an offender because of this reasoning. And I have 2 DNA matches in 2 different cases. So they reinforce each other. So I think that Jacob has shown that this chain evidence reasoning is quite logical. There's no need for an anchor case. We can have 2 cases with insufficient evidence by itself, but with sufficient evidence when you link them. And the link doesn't have to be a similar modus operandi. It can be anything. You can have similar DNA profiles or shoe prints or whatever. So these are also busted. Do I need to have time for discussion, or can I? Okay. What's the use of Bayesian network as a reasoning tool? There are many advantages, I think. For me, it facilitates problem structuring. I tend to like to use them. When you construct the Bayesian networks, you have to think about the problem, and it's useful. Well, obviously, it enables you to do probability calculus that is very hard by hand. It makes also the logic of probabilistic reasoning very explicit. And it makes the assumptions and definitions very explicit, so you're forced to make these very clear. It makes it explicit what is missing. You know, we have to calculate this probability and put it in a table, and we don't know what it is. You can do sensitivity analysis. It also enables subjective assessment of a likelihood ratio in very complex situations. And it's also a useful tool to pinpoint exactly where two experts disagree. So if you put two experts in court and they will disagree with each other and it's not clear exactly what they disagree about, if you have Bayesian networks, the experts can say, well, in this node, in this table, you put the wrong number. Didn't you read this paper, etc.? Or, this, you didn't consider this factor because it's not in the network. And the discussion becomes more focused. Also, disadvantages, I think, if you show a Bayesian network in court, it would need a lot of explaining and live demos and it needs many assumptions and estimates, and some of them are sort of hidden in the model and definitions and tables. It may suggest an exactness to some people that isn't there, or some causal structure or whatever. It's quite sensitive to small differences in definitions of nodes and states, and it's quite elaborative to make one. So if you want to introduce it in casework, I think we don't want to present it in court. I think we want to present it to use it as an expert for reasoning. But if we actually want to do that, for lots of casework, it needs a lot of time. We need to think about how to validate the model. I mean, is it a good model or a bad model? We need to be clear on how to document the thing for quality reasons. And we need to obtain casework. I mean, and if you want to present it actually and use it in a report, then a lot of lawyers don't like that because they don't want their case to be the guinea pig. So my conclusion is that there are many general rules in interpreting DNA, and many of them are myths. I can't pronounce this word. And what should be done is not using this rule-based reasoning saying if we have this then always that. Each case should be evaluated in a probabilistic way. People should think about probabilities, but this is complex and many probabilities are involved, and I think Bayesian networks are very useful to assist in this probabilistic reasoning. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah, actually I have a small comment on your very first one about the database. A number of years ago, Peter Donnelly gave this example. He said, assume you have a database consisting of everybody in your population. And you go through and you get a match, and that's a unique match. That surely, assuming there's no errors, and that type of database, you could set it up so it'll be almost error-free. And that's got to be very convincing, and yet that's got to be the biggest database you could think of.
Yeah.
So I think that's another example that shows that's a myth.
Yeah. So there are many publications about this, and I thought this was a really good sort of example explaining why it's actually increasing the evidential value.
Very nice talk. For me, your pronunciations were excellent, but
Especially good man.
Thank you.
So who are we the Dutch? So why do you think these are depressing? Well, that's not what I really wanted to ask, because I actually think that these are just wise or something.
It's depressing that reality is so complex.
But my real question is associated with open worlds, closed worlds. So when a world is closed, statistics and probability theory work very nicely. For instance, if you think of die, then you have a fixed context and everything works nicely. Also, if you have the Cluedo situation, or Cluedo as we say in the Netherlands, then also there is a closed world and everything works nicely. One of the very big hurdles for probabilistic reasoning is that there is always this possibility that something new turns out there is, after all, a conspiracy. After all, the police were trying to frame the suspect, etc. Did you also think about that, and what is your personal myth-busting perspective there?
I didn't think about it, let's be honest. I didn't think about it because I never encountered the problem really. So what we're dealing with is evidence that is observed, and the question is, what is it worth, and how is it combined, and what does it tell us about the case, and all the things that could have been observed but are not. So if it's missing evidence, we can interpret it. But like the example you gave, I sort of forgot what it was, but things that you cannot anticipate beforehand, a storm happening or whatever kind of scenario. I never thought of that, no. Sorry.
You raised the very important point about the people not taking account, that you need to take account of the probability of not observing someone's DNA in a particular context, and also the probability of an innocent transfer in a particular context. Now, Pat may have more to say about this, but there's a case that we have been involved with where we've argued that those are very important. They should have been considered, and yet whenever we've asked DNA experts about this, they say, "Oh, nothing is known about these probabilities in that particular context, and therefore you've got to assume you've got to assume basically that there is no probability because we haven't proved that." I mean, that's essentially what. Or they'll say you can't make the assumption there, but if there's no evidence for that particular, for the possibility, for example, of that type of transfer, or the absence of evidence, you've got to assume that it.
Well, there is a probability, but you don't know.
No, they say that's what we've had these discussions many times.
Well, I think what they're saying is not that the probability is not relevant, but that simply they don't know what it is.
No,
some
that's
of them
different things.
Some of them have said much stronger than that. But the point, and then the other thing is, leading on from that, is why is there seems to be very little research that are done for calculating what those probabilities are in what we would consider to be quite common circumstances. It doesn't seem to be stuff that anyone's worked on.
This is work in progress. So my colleague Kokshoorn actually is doing all sorts of experiments and things like that. So we have there is a thesis, I think, from somebody in Australia looking at houses and where you can find DNA from people, and so we do experiments where people grab each other and toss somebody through the hole of the environment and see how many, where you can find DNA, how much, and stuff like that.
It is becoming more popular in the literature,
Yes.
that sort of experiment.
Yeah.
But there's another complication that's never ever mentioned, and that's the phenomenon of chimerism. And that people can have 2 or 3 different genetic constitutions in different parts of their body. And most
Quite
people,
rare.
well, we don't know that it's rare. We do not know its frequency, and that's the whole point. In some animals, for example, the marmoset, every marmoset that's born is a chimera, and it's shown that it's getting, the more you look at it, the more common it is in humans, yet it's never ever considered, and when the database sampling is always the mouse.
Yeah, so in all cases it can be blood or something.
Yeah, but I mean, if they take samples of someone...
I think if it was really frequent, we would have observed it more often.
You don't take more than one sample.
From the
Reference.
From the reference.
If you're trying to construct a DNA database, which we've got in Britain, you usually take one sample because that's considered the genome. But actually, it depends where you take the sample. We do not know the frequency of chimerism. Just don't know. Just because you haven't found it.
We've done, of course, there is the database thing where you have just the reference profiles. These are bucket swabs. But there's also the cases, and we find semen, we find saliva, we find blood, we find everything, and we compare all of these traces and we compare it to the suspect, and it's gone to a counter laboratory. They redo the whole analysis.
Yes, but
and
the number of criminal cases is small when you consider the human population.
yes.
You see,
Still, I think we have done quite a lot of analysis, quite a number of cases, and I think we should have seen it when it was.
Well, how can you see it if there's not a match? The person will not be convicted.
Well, it would be very.
It can be there's not a match because their DNA in their cheek is different from their DNA in their fingers.
There's one famous case in the Netherlands.
Has any case ever been observed in a human being?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
So it exists.
I was just reading about it on Wikipedia.
Oh, it must be.
So it does exist. It does exist, but I do think it's quite rare, for at least for the loci that we visualize, because otherwise we would have seen it more often.
I do not know the frequency of it.
Okay, I mean, there's also
If it would be more than 5%, we would have seen it more often in our casework.
I don't think so.
Paolo, you had a question. Did you? Oh, God. Okay.
If you can show again the title of the paper by Taroni and friends, because at the moment I was confused if you were talking or they were talking about errors or about uncertainty, because this is the terminology which is rather confused. Now, since 25 years, there is a tendency to distinguish error and uncertainty. Can you show this is the title, just to be sure?
I have to look.
No,
I'm not
sorry.
sure where it is though.
You might have to change the colour of the fonts to get it, depending on this conversation.
No.
I thought it was easier.
You don't have a title. They don't have a title.
No, that's the title.
Yeah.
Yes, the different paper was about
Oh, sorry, it was back. Yeah.
Yeah, this doesn't have a title, yeah.
If I understand correctly, somebody can answer it. Yeah, error means uncertainty on the value. And this, I think, in principle, there's nothing bad.
No, what the paper I was referring to were mistakes. I just learned yesterday that I should have called it mistakes, actually. But so where people mess up and they swap samples and do sorts of things. And so that's the error that they were discussing. And the relevance of that. Am I right? Thank you.
Okay, so we thank Marjan again for a great